The PlayStation 1 really hit the ground running with a lot of great classics in the platforming genre, fighting games, and even a handful of racing games that felt ahead of their time. Most of these games came out well after the launch of the PlayStation though, as early games on the system often struggled with the newfangled three-dimensional spaces and polygonal character models. There were some games that thrived despite being tasked with handling all of this new technology though. Before we begin, please consider subscribing and enabling all notifications by clicking the bell icon. With that out of the way, let's get started. After coming off of the success of the Shadow of the Beast series and Brian the Lion for the Amiga, Reflections Interactive began work on something a little different. Thanks to Sony making sure that they had a PlayStation 1 development kit way before the system actually launched, they would be ready in 1995 with Destruction Derby, a vehicular game that put the racing aside in favor of destruction and combat. The game would feature a nice balance between realism and arcade-style playability that would end up being an excellent mix, as the dynamic physics would degrade your ability to control your vehicle the way you wanted, but it was still very easy to pick up and play at a moment's notice. This was before Carmageddon or even Twisted Metal though, so the playbook on how to make a game like this was basically unwritten. So Reflections went with their gut most of the time, and that proved to be an excellent decision. The game was fun, it was received well, and it even could be considered a bit of a pioneer when it comes to realistic car damage and crash physics. So why aren't we seeing Destruction Derby games anymore? Why has the series given way to completely different franchises? What the hell happened to the Destruction Derby series? As we touched on, the first Destruction Derby game was quite good. Lots of great physics surrounding the damage of your cars driving differently upon taking said damage, great visuals, and just a nice package all around. The game would review and sell well, and the fact that there were only so many games on the PS1 at the time certainly helped with sales. The original PlayStation version was ultimately the most popular, but it also got ports to the Sega Saturn, the N64, and PC. All of these versions would review well, with the Saturn version being the inferior one, but still more than enjoyable on the whole. Most of the game's success certainly seemed to come from the game's mix of a simple pick-up-and-play mentality and its ability to also feel rather deep with the different outcomes any event could have with its crash physics. While the detailed nature of the crashing was slimmed down through development to compensate for the limitations of the consoles, it still ended up feeling very realistic to players at the time. There were some areas that left room for improvement though. The soundtrack was fairly unremarkable and the controls weren't quite as tight as you might expect if you're coming off of a Sega Rally game or Gran Turismo. Some of the tracks also got a little long in the tooth, with there being hardly any obstacles or ramps to mix things up. However, as you might expect, the game did well enough to justify a sequel and an opportunity to address these things, and that's exactly what happened. Destruction Derby 2 went right into production after the first, and the team at Reflections Interactive came out with yet another great game. The driving was a bit more tight and the graphics slightly improved. Only slightly because the first one looked so good there really wasn't much more to improve on in that department. But more importantly, the tracks would now have far more going on. You could now execute big jumps, as well as repair your car with the addition of pit stops, keeping you in the game despite maybe getting off to a bad start. Development for the game was only about 7 months, and it's pretty amazing what they were able to get done in that time. A complete overhaul of the engine that allowed for more hills and better draw distance, better physics that allowed cars to handle being flipped over much better, and the collision physics largely remaining unchanged as they pretty much worked perfectly in the original. Cars were also redesigned slightly to give them more of an American feel than the British look of the last game, and the tracks had far more variety despite the game having roughly the same amount of them. While all these additions were roundly applauded by those playing the PlayStation version, it was far less impressive to those reviewing the PC port. Apparently, it had some rather high system requirements for the time, yet didn't really deliver on what those requirements generally were intended for. On top of that, many PC reviewers mentioned that the difficulty was higher than that on the PlayStation, making it less balanced and thusly less fun. Still, the game was received fairly well overall. It would be another few years before the series would rear its head again, but now it would be in the form of Destruction Derby Raw, which unfortunately wouldn't enjoy nearly any of the praise the previous two versions would get. It was the year 2000, and many were moving over to the PS2 or preparing to, so this was not the time for a game on the PS1 to rest on its laurels. Sadly, that's exactly what Destruction Derby Raw did though. Being in the hands of a new developer, the decision behind the scenes was likely to just play it safe and make a game that was comparable to the last one, because that's exactly what it was. Nothing special, nothing horrible, just another Destruction Derby game. If the game came out in 1998, that might have been fine, but this was not the time for that. The PS1 was archaic compared to the PS2, and too many next-generation racing games were on the way that would erase what little relevance the series still had at this point. Destruction Derby Arenas would take a stab at the PS2 generation, and have mixed results at best. The game itself looked pretty good, but also didn't really stand out visually. It would have a decent online mode, but again, nothing super special, especially when compared to the Burnouts and Need for Speeds that were out at the time. Arenas would get middling review scores with a handful of below-average ones as well. It seemed that the spotlight had just moved on from the Destruction Derby series. This was a time when racing fans just wanted other things. Fast and flashy was in, and all the work that the Destruction Derby series had put into getting damage physics right and making sure the arenas were adequately varied with things to do wasn't really enough to distract from other games, so sales were pretty soft. This is the last we've heard of the series in 2004, but perhaps with games like Wreckfest and other racers with an emphasis on crashing and damage popping up, we could see another swing being taken at the franchise one day. That's all for now. If you enjoy what you saw, please hit the like button. And if you're new to the channel, now is a great time to subscribe. We upload brand new videos every single day. After subscribing, don't forget to enable all notifications by clicking the bell icon. Thanks for watching this video, and we'll see you next time, right here on GamingBolt.